The sun was setting over the quiet town of Willow Creek when the first signs appeared. A thick fog rolled in from nowhere, curling around the narrow streets, and casting the familiar town in an unfamiliar, ghostly light. The townsfolk noticed it first, the smell of burnt sugar and something else, something metallic and bitter, carried on the wind. By the time night had fully fallen, the posters were already plastered on every available surface. The Circus of the Damned, one night only. No one knew how they got there or who had put them up. The posters showed a black tent with crimson stripes, its peaks rising into the night sky like dark spires. Beneath the tent, shadows hinted at horrors untold, with only the faint glow of torches lighting the way. Curiosity spread through the town like wildfire. It had been years since anything exciting had happened in Willow Creek. The people, starved for entertainment, found themselves drawn to the idea of something new, something mysterious. They didn't question the sudden appearance of the circus or the strangeness that accompanied it. They simply wanted to see it, to be a part of whatever spectacle awaited. As dusk deepened, the townspeople gathered at the edge of town, where a field had been transformed overnight into a carnival ground. The tent was even larger than the posters had suggested, towering above the town like an ancient cathedral of black and red. Torches flickered in the wind, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The gate creaked open, revealing the entrance to the tent. One by one, they stepped inside, leaving the safety of their familiar world behind. The air grew colder as they entered, the smell of the circus thickening, growing more pungent, more wrong. But none of them turned back. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, swallowed by the darkness ahead, as they ventured deeper into the unknown. Willow Creek, once so quiet and peaceful, was about to become the stage for a nightmare that no one could have anticipated. The inside of the tent was impossibly vast, far larger than it seemed from the outside. Rows of wooden benches circled the center stage, where a single spotlight illuminated the sawdust-covered ground. The air was thick with anticipation, the whispers of the crowd blending with the faint hum of unseen machinery. Then, without warning, the lights dimmed, and a low, eerie music began to play, an old, warped melody that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the empty stage. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, thin man dressed in a tailcoat as black as night. His face was hidden beneath a porcelain mask, its features twisted into a perpetual smile. He moved with a fluid grace, his every step commanding the attention of the crowd. This was the ringmaster, the conductor of the evening's horrors. "Welcome!" his voice boomed, echoing through the cavernous space. "Welcome to the Circus of the Damned, where your darkest fears come to life." With a dramatic sweep of his arm, the spotlight shifted, revealing the first act, a young woman chained to a wooden post, her eyes wide with terror. The audience gasped, unsure if this was part of the show or something more sinister. The ringmaster's smile widened beneath his mask. "Behold, the dance of the condemned," he announced. The music swelled, a frantic, discordant tune that set the audience's nerves on edge. The woman began to move, her body contorting in unnatural ways, as if pulled by invisible strings. Her screams cut through the air, sharp and raw, echoing through the tent. Blood seeped from her wrists where the chains bit into her flesh, and yet she continued to dance, her movements growing more frenzied with each passing second. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unable to look away. The performance was too real, too visceral. It was as if they could feel her pain, her despair. Some of them glanced around, searching for reassurance in the faces of their neighbors, but found only the same mix of horror and fascination reflected back at them. The dance ended as abruptly as it had begun. The woman collapsed to the ground, her body still and lifeless, her chains lying slack beside her. The ringmaster stepped forward, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, our next act awaits." The spotlight faded, leaving the audience in darkness. The tension in the air was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed down on them from all sides. They had come for entertainment, for a thrill, but this was something else entirely. Something darker. Something far more dangerous. The darkness held them in its grasp, as they waited for what would come next, the thrill of the unknown mingling with a growing sense of dread. The days passed in a strange haze for the people of Willow Creek. The circus had taken hold of the town, its presence looming like a dark shadow over every conversation, every fleeting thought. By day, the town seemed almost normal, though the scent of burnt sugar still lingered in the air, an unwelcome reminder of what awaited them each night. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog returned, and with it the whispers. It started as a murmur, barely audible above the daily chatter. Stories passed from one person to the next, voices lowered as if afraid of being overheard by unseen ears. Someone claimed they had recognized one of the performers, a face from the past, someone who had disappeared years ago without a trace. Others nodded in agreement, recalling faces that seemed eerily familiar, though they couldn't quite place where they had seen them before. As more people spoke of these strange resemblances, a chilling theory began to take shape. The performers were not mere actors or circus folk, but the lost and forgotten souls of the town itself. Those who had vanished without explanation, now returned in a form no one could have imagined. The rumors spread quickly, feeding the growing unease. Some said the performers were trapped in the circus, forced to relive their darkest moments for eternity. Others whispered that the ringmaster held some dark power over them, binding them to his will with ancient, forbidden magic. There were those who claimed to have seen the performers up close, their eyes hollow and filled with a deep, unending sorrow, a sorrow that seemed to mirror the fears of the townsfolk themselves. Yet despite the whispers, despite the growing sense of dread, they continued to return to the circus each night. Drawn by a morbid curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, something more insidious. They told themselves it was just a show, that the horrors they witnessed were nothing more than clever tricks and illusions. But in their hearts, they began to wonder if there was something more, something they didn't fully understand. The fog thickened each night, wrapping the town in its cold embrace. The posters, once vibrant, now appeared faded and torn, as if the circus itself was slowly decaying, yet its hold on the town only grew stronger. Those who dared to speak of leaving found themselves strangely reluctant, as if an invisible force kept them tethered to the place, unable to break free. And so they stayed, waiting for the next performance, their nerves frayed, their minds teetering on the edge. Each night, the tension mounted, the fear growing sharper, more acute. They felt as if they were part of something terrible, something inescapable, though they could not yet name it. The circus had become more than just a spectacle. It was a living, breathing entity, feeding on their fear, growing stronger with each passing day. And in the quiet moments, when the whispers grew louder and the fog closed in, they wondered, had the circus come to them, or had they unknowingly summoned it, a manifestation of their deepest, darkest fears? The air inside the tent was thick with tension as the fourth night's performance drew near. The crowd shuffled in with a strange mix of anticipation and dread, the whispered rumors of the past days gnawing at their thoughts. Every glance at the ringmaster's masked face sent a shiver down their spines, but none could turn away. They were prisoners to their own curiosity. But that night, one man couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Jacob, a local farmer with a keen eye and a stubborn streak, had been watching the circus from a distance, his suspicions growing with each passing day. He had heard the whispers, the stories of lost souls and dark magic, and something in them resonated deep within him. He knew he had to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing whatever darkness lurked within the circus. Under the cover of night, long after the townspeople had returned to their homes, Jacob crept through the fog to the circus grounds. The tent loomed before him, a towering monolith of shadows and silence. He hesitated at the entrance, the memory of the horrific performances fresh in his mind, but steeled himself and slipped inside. The tent was eerily quiet, the usual hum of machinery and distant voices absent. Jacob's footsteps were muffled by the thick sawdust that covered the ground, and the dim light of his lantern cast long, flickering shadows that danced around him like specters. He moved cautiously, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he approached the heart of the circus. There, behind the stage, he found them. The performers, those strange, haunted figures who had terrified the town each night, were gathered in a small, dimly lit room. But they were different now, hollow, lifeless, their eyes vacant and dull. The chains that had bound them during the performances were gone, but their wrists bore deep, bloodied grooves, as if the memory of their bondage still clung to them. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth. These were not actors or mere performers. They were the very souls of the damned, caught in an endless cycle of torment. The circus was their prison, a place where they were forced to relive their worst nightmares, night after night, for the amusement of others. And the ringmaster, he was no ordinary man, but something far darker, something that thrived on their suffering. As Jacob watched, the performers stirred, as if sensing his presence. Their heads turned in unison, their lifeless eyes fixing on him with a gaze that chilled him to the bone. He wanted to run, to flee from the horror he had uncovered, but his feet were rooted to the ground, paralyzed by the weight of what he had seen. The ringmaster appeared in the doorway, his masked face unreadable, but Jacob could feel the dark energy radiating from him, a force that held the performers in its grip and now reached out to him, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. "You've seen too much." The ringmaster's voice echoed in the small room, rich with a sinister glee. "Now you too shall join the show." Before Jacob could react, the performers moved, their hands reaching out to him with surprising speed and strength. The last thing he saw was the ringmaster's twisted smile beneath his mask as the darkness closed in around him. The next night, the townspeople gathered once more, their curiosity undiminished despite the gnawing fear that had taken root in their hearts. The show began as usual, the ringmaster's booming voice welcoming them back, promising a night of terror and thrills. And there, among the performers, was a new face, a man who looked disturbingly familiar, his eyes wide with the same vacant despair that haunted all the others. The townspeople watched, their minds wrestling with the recognition, but the horror of the performance soon drowned out any thoughts of the man's identity. Only a few whispered his name, but their voices were lost in the cacophony of screams that filled the tent as the night wore on, and another soul was claimed by the circus of the damned. The air in Willow Creek grew heavier with each passing night. The townspeople, once eager for the spectacle, now approached the circus with trepidation. The allure of the performances had twisted into something darker, something they couldn't fully understand but felt deep in their bones. Yet, like moths to a flame, they returned, unable to resist the pull of the strange and macabre show that had ensnared their lives. On the fifth night, the atmosphere in the tent was different. The usual buzz of anticipation was overshadowed by an uneasy silence, a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The townspeople filled the benches, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes darting nervously from one shadow to the next. The familiar scent of burnt sugar hung in the air, now tainted with a coppery undertone of fear. The ringmaster appeared once more, his masked face reflecting the dim light. But tonight, his presence felt even more sinister, as if the darkness that clung to him had grown stronger, more oppressive. His voice boomed through the tent, but it lacked the theatrical flair of previous nights. There was something colder in his tone, something final. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words dripping with a cruel amusement, "tonight's performance is not merely for your entertainment, it is a lesson. A lesson in the cost of curiosity, of desire, and of fear." The spotlight shifted, illuminating the center of the ring, where a group of performers stood huddled together. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with the same hollow despair that had begun to haunt the dreams of the townspeople. But there was something different about them tonight, a desperation that hadn't been there before, a flicker of awareness in their gaze. The crowd watched, breathless, as the performers were led to the center of the ring. Chains clinked as they were bound together, their bodies trembling with a fear that seemed to resonate through the very fabric of the tent. The music began, low and discordant, a twisted version of the circus melody that had once seemed so innocent. One by one, the performers were forced to act out scenes that grew increasingly violent, increasingly grotesque. Their cries of pain and terror were real, too real, echoing through the tent with a rawness that tore at the sanity of the spectators. Blood splattered the sawdust-covered ground, the scent mingling with the heavy, metallic air. And then, something shifted in the audience. At first, it was just a few, people clutching their heads, their eyes wide with confusion and terror. They started to scream, the sound piercing and wild, as if they had seen something the others hadn't. But it spread quickly, like wildfire. More and more of the townspeople began to cry out, their voices joining the chorus of agony that filled the tent. Those who weren't screaming stared at the performers with growing horror, their minds struggling to process what they were witnessing. The faces of the performers, those familiar faces, were shifting, distorting, becoming reflections of the townspeople themselves. It was as if the line between performer and spectator was blurring, twisting into something incomprehensible. The ringmaster's voice cut through the chaos, cold and sharp. "You see, this is not just a performance. This is your reality, your fears made flesh. You came seeking thrills, but the price of your curiosity is the truth. The truth." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The audience, now in the grip of madness, began to understand this was no mere show. The performers were not just damned souls, they were them. The townspeople themselves, trapped in a cycle of torment that they had willingly entered. Every night they had returned to the circus, and every night a piece of them had been claimed, twisted into the nightmare that played out before them. The performance reached its climax, the performers collapsing in a heap of blood and broken bodies. The tent was filled with the sound of weeping, of despair, as the townspeople realized the horror of their situation. They were not spectators, they were participants, and the circus had ensnared them all. As the lights dimmed and the final notes of the twisted melody played, the ringmaster stepped forward, his masked face impassive. "Thank you for joining us tonight," he said with a mocking bow. "We look forward to your return." The tent plunged into darkness, leaving the townspeople to stumble out into the cold night air, their minds shattered by the truth they could no longer deny. The circus had claimed them, body and soul, and there would be no escape. The town of Willow Creek was unraveling. The once tight-knit community had fractured, its people now haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow, as if they carried the weight of a terrible secret. But there were whispers of rebellion, of a group determined to confront the ringmaster and end the nightmare that had gripped their town. On the sixth night, a small band of townsfolk, their nerves frayed but their resolve strong, gathered at the edge of the circus grounds. They had armed themselves with whatever they could find, pitchforks, lanterns, anything that might fend off the darkness they knew awaited them inside. At their lead was a woman named Clara, a schoolteacher with a steely determination in her eyes. She had lost her husband to the circus. He had vanished after the third night, his face now haunting the performances as one of the damned. Clara had nothing left to lose. The fog was thicker than ever, wrapping around them like a living thing as they made their way toward the towering tent. The air was cold, biting, the distant echoes of the night's preparations a constant reminder of the evil that lay within. But they pressed on, driven by the hope that they could break the cycle, that they could save what remained of their town. As they approached the tent, they found the entrance already open, a dark maw inviting them into the abyss. The flickering torchlight cast eerie shadows on the canvas walls, and the scent of burnt sugar was overpowering, almost nauseating. Clara hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, the others following close behind. The interior of the tent was as vast and ominous as they remembered, but tonight it felt different. The benches were empty, the center ring eerily still. The silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by the distant creak of the wooden beams overhead. They had expected to find the audience already seated, but the emptiness only deepened their sense of dread. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the ringmaster or his twisted performers. But the tent seemed deserted, a ghostly version of the place that had haunted their nightmares. Clara's grip tightened on the lantern she held, its dim light flickering as if in fear. Then, from the shadows, the ringmaster emerged. He moved with that same fluid grace, his masked face unreadable, his presence sending a wave of cold fear through the group. He stood at the edge of the ring, watching them with an air of detached amusement, as if he had been expecting them all along. "Ah, brave souls," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Come to end the show, have you? To break the chains of fate?" Clara stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her insides. "We know what you've done," she said. You've taken our people, twisted them into your playthings. We won't let you continue. The ringmaster tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. You think you understand, but you know nothing of the forces at play here, he replied, his voice low and menacing. This circus is older than time itself. It feeds on fear, on the darkness within every soul. You cannot destroy what has always been. Clara raised the lantern, the light flaring brighter in her trembling hand. We'll see about that, she said, her voice firm. With a shout, the group charged forward, their weapons raised, ready to strike. But as they crossed the threshold into the ring, the ground beneath them shifted, the sawdust swirling as if alive. The air grew thick, heavy, and an overwhelming sense of dread pressed down on them, slowing their movements to a crawl. The ringmaster's laugh echoed through the tent, a sound that chilled them to the core. You cannot fight what you cannot comprehend, he taunted, his voice seeming to come from all directions at once. You are but players in this eternal game, and your roles have already been decided. The group faltered, their resolve wavering as the tent seemed to close in around them. The shadows grew deeper, the air colder, until they could barely see one another through the gloom. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, fear threatening to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to take another step forward. Suddenly the performers appeared, their twisted forms emerging from the darkness. They moved with unnatural speed, surrounding the group, their eyes hollow and filled with that same vacant despair. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the faces of her neighbors, her friends, her husband, now one of the damned, his expression a mask of sorrow and pain. The ringmaster watched with cold satisfaction as the performers closed in, their chains clinking softly with each step. This is your fate, he intoned. To join the others, to become part of the show. You sought to challenge the circus, but the circus has claimed you, as it has claimed all who came before. Clara's hand shook, the lantern's light flickering dangerously low. Desperation clawed at her mind as the performers reached out, their cold hands brushing against her skin. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the weight of the truth was crushing her spirit. In that moment she understood, the circus wasn't just a place. It was a force, an inescapable entity that consumed everything in its path. It fed on the fears of the living, turning them into nightmares made real, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment. As the darkness closed in, Clara's last thought was of the town she had tried to save. But there was no saving Willow Creek now. The circus had taken them all, and there would be no escape. The ringmaster's voice was the last thing she heard, a final, chilling whisper as the light of the lantern finally died. Welcome to the show. The morning sun rose over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the deserted streets. The fog that had clung to the town like a shroud was gone, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. The circus tent, once looming and menacing, had vanished without a trace, as if it had never existed. But the town was not the same. A palpable emptiness lingered in the air, a void that nothing could fill. As the townspeople emerged from their homes, they found the streets eerily quiet. The faces they expected to see, their neighbors, their friends, were absent. Panic set in as they began to realize how many were missing, those who had ventured to the circus the night before and never returned. Their names were whispered in hushed tones, fear gnawing at the edges of every conversation. But there were no answers, only the terrible silence where the circus had been. A sense of unease spread through the town, a feeling that something was horribly wrong, even for those who had not witnessed the final night's horror. They could feel it deep in their bones, an inexplicable dread that clung to them like a second skin. The memories of the circus lingered, not just in their minds but in the very air they breathed. And then, they began to notice the changes. It started small, a reflection in a shop window that lingered too long, a fleeting glimpse of a familiar face that vanished when looked at directly. The townspeople saw them in the corners of their eyes, the faces of those who had disappeared. But these were not the people they had known. They were twisted, distorted, their eyes filled with the same hollow despair as the performers in the circus. They were shadows, echoes of the souls claimed by the circus of the damned. The sightings grew more frequent, more vivid, until it became impossible to ignore. The missing were everywhere, in mirrors, in windows, in the darkness just beyond the reach of light. They were trapped, bound to the town as the circus had been bound to them. And with each passing day, the boundaries between the living and the damned grew thinner, more fragile. The townspeople could feel it, the creeping cold that seeped into their homes, their hearts. It was as if the circus had left a part of itself behind, an indelible mark on the town that could never be erased. The laughter of children fell silent, the joy of daily life drained away, replaced by a growing sense of doom. And then the whispers began again. They spoke of a new show, a performance that would take place at the stroke of midnight. But this time, there were no posters, no invitations. The whispers came from nowhere and everywhere, voices that only the townspeople could hear, urging them to attend, to witness the final act. As midnight approached, the people of Willow Creek gathered in the town square, drawn by a force they could not resist. There was no tent, no ringmaster, only the darkness that enveloped them as they stood together, trembling with fear. They looked around at each other, at the faces that had once been so familiar, now pale and drawn, eyes wide with the same unspoken terror. The clock struck midnight, and the darkness came alive. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely human, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of agony. They were the missing, the lost souls who had been taken by the circus, now returned to claim the living. The townspeople tried to run, to flee, but the darkness closed in, swallowing their screams, their desperate pleas for mercy. The final act had begun. The town of Willow Creek was consumed by the nightmare it had unwittingly summoned. The living and the damned became one, their fates intertwined in an endless cycle of torment. The circus had left, but it had taken the town with it, turning it into a place where nightmares reigned and no one was ever truly free. In the end, there was no escape, no salvation. The circus of the damned had claimed them all, and the show would go on forever, with the townspeople as its eternal performers, trapped in the roles they had unknowingly accepted. The sun rose again, but Willow Creek was no more. Only a ghost town remained, haunted by the shadows of those who had once lived, now forever part of the circus's dark legacy. And somewhere, far away, the tent was rising once more, its crimson and black stripes catching the wind as it prepared for its next performance, its next victims, in another unsuspecting town. The circus was eternal. The show would never end.